Hussan, so excited to have you on our show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the word immigrant strikes fear in the minds of many people.
Mm-hmm.
And, we know that politicians also use, the immigration issue to get voters or to, dissuade voters.
Mm-hmm.
So what is it about immigrants that gets people riled up?
I think you've hit it right on the head, right? Basically, we are in a moment right now where around the world politicians have realized that if they make us fight each other, then we don't focus on who's really responsible. Now, we all feel fear. We're uncertain about our jobs, we're uncertain about our children's future, we're uncertain about the climate. We all have anxieties, and those anxieties and fears are being played on. And the easiest way to distract us is to make us fight each other for scraps. Now, historically, this has sometimes been poor people, sometimes it's been different communities, but right now it's immigrants. And it's not just in Canada or the United States. I mean, we know Trump did it. That's how he won the elections. In Quebec, for example, the current governing party campaigned for a 20% reduction in immigration, and they won votes, right? But you can see it in the Philippines, you can see it in Pakistan, you can see it in Turkey, or you can see it across Western Europe, that anti-immigration, demonization of migrants wins votes.
And in fact, this has been a fear from the beginning of time. People have always been afraid of outsiders or people who look different.
I think this is something different. I think it's not that we've always, of course, we've always been afraid of others, but now there's a systematic campaign and strategy at the time of elections to demonize migrants. You can see it with the rhetoric that's employed by politicians. They're not, those are focus grouped and assessed and polled, like what comes out of Trump's mouth or that's resonating. So similarly, we have entire right-wing institutions that produce, reports. Then there are people on social media who basically produce fake news, misrepresentations of immigrants. So we're in a very specific moment, and all of us are convinced, right? Even
so
I
why
believe
why do you think that? I mean, why do you think that people are convinced by this rhetoric? Is it because this rhetoric is tapping into certain fears that people actually have within themselves?
I think first and foremost, it's propaganda, and propaganda works, right? People are responding because we are being acted on, right? And so as I said, we have fears about our jobs, right? But who's really responsible for our job losses? Who's really responsible for our wage theft? Immigrants aren't coming and, standing with a gun trying to steal a job, but people believe that, right? But who sets the actual wages? The bosses do. So it's a way to distract us from the real people who are responsible. That's, the super, super rich around the world. I mean, in Canada, 2 people own more wealth than 11 million people. They are the ones responsible for our overall high cost of living and high cost of housing, not migrants.
So how would you respond to the claim that, immigrants are taking advantage of our social system? They're getting financial assistance from the government.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely one of the very common things we hear, immigrants are somehow taking. And what's underlying it is that we've been meant to believe that there's simply not enough. There are not enough jobs, there's not enough services. It's scarcity. We just don't have enough. And so in times of scarcity, what do? We try and close ourselves off. But let's see who's actually responsible for scarcity. So the Canadian Revenue Agency just said that 24 to 29% of all corporate taxes were not paid in Canada, right? So that's 1 in 3 to 1 in 4 people, corporations didn't pay taxes. Now that's why we don't have enough. It's not because immigrants are stealing money. Similarly, right now, the 100 richest CEOs in this country make more money by 11:40 a.m. on January 2nd than the rest of us do in the whole year, right? So on the first day of work, before lunch, they make more money than the rest of us. So there's an actual sucking out of our resources, of our wealth, of our services, right to the very top. And 80 people now own more money than 2/3 of the world's population. So that's really what's causing our scarcity, not migrants.
So from what I understand from what you're saying is that we're looking at people who are marginalized as the source of our problems, whereas we should widen our scope and look at the top and see the people who are actually benefiting.
Right, and also that we are being fooled into doing that, right? We are being played. We are facing, and this happens always around the elections, right? And we're convinced that this is appropriate. So when we look at, for example, migrants in Canada, right? One of the things is in Toronto, the city put up posters in the shelters, and other people put up posters in the shelters saying, we're out of shelter beds because all of the shelter beds have gone to refugees, right? Now, this is a blatant lie. We've had a 10-year shelter crisis. We have a 10-year housing crisis. Nobody who lives in Toronto thinks this city is affordable, right? Except unless you're super rich.
Yes.
But then suddenly, we're being led to believe that these refugees who arrived in the last 24 months are suddenly responsible for the crisis. So it's always a distraction.
And I've heard the argument that refugees are taking, are getting more assistance than, for example, pensioners.
Right, this is another one. Now, here's what's important about this is that research was done to show that there was a think tank that produced this, that they actually focus grouped and put it out, first in Britain, then in Ireland, then in Germany, then in Norway, and then in Canada, right? This pitting of pensioners against migrants. Now, in Canada...
Or veterans even.
Or veterans, exactly, right? So this, again, veterans and pensioners are some of the poorest people in our society. We know that. And so are refugees. So what we're being made to do is fight at the bottom of the barrel for scraps, right? Because how much is it? It's, approximately $700. That's social assistance per month in this province. It's, not more than that in other places. The fact of the matter is, no refugee gets more social assistance than a veteran. I mean, that's obvious. Those are the facts. But we have to focus on the logic. We are being made to fight each other. And we need to stop. And we need to think about what would it take for us to actually unite and say, look, it doesn't matter where we come from, what our religion is, how we arrived here. If we are poor, if we are working, we probably have a stronger common interest.
Now, there's a lot of also concern that people have about the social aspects, so about how immigrants are integrating in Canadian society. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. I mean, I think people are always concerned right now, and there's a lot of this play that's happening. So, for example, just this week, there was all of these media that was put out of a shareable and a meme and a research that was done 3 years ago. And these were these fake news alerts that said, no dogs are allowed on behalf of Muslims, right?
I saw
and
those, yeah.
Exactly. And so those are recirculating. And why are they recirculating? They're recirculating because we're closer to an election, right? So we have all of these notions, people were like, oh, the Muslims are bringing Sharia to this country, or, oh, those people are bringing their culture, they are bringing their food, and it's going to somehow dismantle or disrupt us. Fact of the matter is that most people who come to the country in 2 generations lose their first language, right? Most people who come to this country today in 2 or 3 generations are actually completely integrated in the society. And sometimes that's not a good thing, right? Like, why should we need to be growing cultures and values and systems? And also, the original language of these territories has never been English. English is in enforcement, right? Like, we need to be speaking Anishinaabe Moed. We need to be speaking Mohawk.
So I think we should talk about the fact that many of us living here are immigrants to this country.
Yeah, I think people are migrants, they're settlers, they're colonizers, they're people who are temporary foreign workers, they're refugees. People are forced to come here, people come here by choice, people came here to conquer. It's a very mixed history, and there are people who are indigenous, right? And there have been waves of people. There was a time that Irish and Italian and Jewish communities were considered immigrants, but foreigners, right, who were deported, who were told that they were racialized. They were treated as if they were racialized and excluded from our society. But now, of course, people would think those are white, those are Canadian, right? So the definition of who's white, who's Canadian, who's from here changes on the basis of who has the resources and whose interest does it serve to divide people. And currently, it serves the interest of people like Trump, people like Bolsonaro, people like Netanyahu and Modi, for us to be fighting each other.
What about the argument that people make that immigrants are a security threat, or even that they commit crimes?
I mean, absolutely. We hear this all the time. People will say, I'm not against legal immigrants. I'm against illegal immigrants. I'm not against the good refugees. I'm just against the bogus ones. I'm against the people who are breaking laws and policies. Now, there are 2 things that come up here. First is that if you look at, for example, Loblaws, right? Loblaws is one of the richest companies in this country, and they were found to be fixing the price of bread for 14 years. So they fixed the price of food, right? There's $346 million that they haven't paid in taxes, right? And they have never been tried for any crime, okay? Now, so we have to understand who's really breaking the laws in this country. Separately, we have this understanding that the system is rational and fair, so it's wrong for people to break laws. But the system isn't rational. Let me just give you a couple examples. One is farm workers. Farm workers in this country are not allowed to get minimum wage, overtime pay, they're not allowed to unionize, they're not allowed to get public holiday pay. That's not rational. Why should the people who grow our food be excluded from all minimum wage laws?
So it's almost like we're forcing them to do illegal things to just survive.
It's not so much people in these cases rarely end up breaking the law because it's very difficult. What I'm trying to more say is that the idea is that the system is orderly and rational, and so there are some people who are breaking it. There's a queue and some people are jumping it. And that's actually not the case. It's an irrational system. So the government, for example, in 2008 in Canada, threw away all the existing permanent residency applications. Why? These people had stood in the queue, applied, did all the things right, and suddenly they were dismissed. In Quebec last month, the government threw out 20% of all immigration applications in the country, in the province, 1 in 5. Again, everywhere we look, right? So for example, people talk a lot about the border crosses from the United States, and they're like, why are they walking across? So today, if you walk across an actual border station into Canada from the United States, you cannot apply for refugee status. If you fly in, you can. Okay, if you fly in from anywhere in the world, you can. If you walk 5 steps to the right, you can. If you walk 5 steps to the left, you can. But just you can't from the actual border post. And that's an irrational law. So people in that case are forced to break an irrational law to apply for refugee status to be able to survive. So it's not so much that migrants are breaking the laws. It's the rich, it's the super rich, at the cost of all of us. And the system is irrational, and it's constantly being broken by those at the top.
So, I mean, how can we fight that? Because you're telling me that this rhetoric is institutionalized and it's structural. So how does the ordinary average person living in Canada, how do we combat that sort of thinking?
Right. So I think there are 3 things to remember. One is scarcity, which is what you spoke about. There's no scarcity here. There's enough if the rich pay their fair share. The second is fear. We have to understand that yes, there is real anxieties, there are uncertainties about our future, but again, migrants are not responsible. And third, this notion of law and order and systems, and we have to remember again that the people breaking the laws and taking the most from us are those at the top, and it's an irrational system. So if we understand scarcity, fear, and law and order, we'll be able to respond better. The other thing is we have to talk about solidarity. So what individuals need to do is we need to understand ourselves not as like different and distinct based on where we come from, what we look like, but rather as part of people who work. Right? We have a common identity as workers, as people who spend their days and nights trying to make ends meet. And that is a shared identity that we need to build on, so then we can unite. That's called solidarity.
Because sometimes immigrants are pitted against each other and they see each other as enemies.
Totally. Refugees against farm workers against domestic workers against students, and then this community versus that community. And we're all being played against each other. You know, in many parts of this country, what they'll do is they'll hire one batch of workers from one country and the next year from another country so that they can make them fight. So absolutely, we need to bring migrant solidarity, we need to unite against racism, and we need to unite on the principle that we are workers and not the rich.
I hope this conversation will help us towards that. Thank you very much, Hussan.
Thank you for having me.